Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm kind of wondering. Now they have the circle.
It's actually not that bad.
I just did that with like
I just got a request. Just got a request for next week's trivia to be of medical in nature because we have two people from the medical field, and so if you want to make requests so you have a better chance of winning, you just let me know, and I'll cater it to what you know. So I'm kidding. I'm not going to cater it to you. That will not happen.
Greg tried pinwheels.
We're going to do trivia, everything you needed to know about pinwheels next week. Once again, if you want to get the book, you may follow along. Some of you how many of you have the book and are following along? I hope I'm not ruining it for you. So if you want to get, there is a link. In order to do that, it is not necessary. I cover the bulk of the information in this class. So if you don't have the book, you're good. And then you don't have to read. So there you go. Let's recap. Week one, we talked about 3 P's that help us to understand the culture in which the Bible was written. What were those 3 P's and what do they mean? Patriarchal, what's it mean? You remember? The male, yes, the oldest living male was central to the larger society. What are the other 2? Patrilineal, which meant what? What's that? Oh, got you with a mouthful. Gotcha. Yeah, so patrilineal, the ancestral line it goes through the male figures of the line. And what's the last one? It definitely starts with a P. Patrilocal, which means the living space of the family and the tribe revolved around whom? The patriarch, the oldest living male. Tell me, because I'm not out there, how's the volume? Do I need to turn it up or down? Are we good? For money? Okay, sweet. All right. So that was week 1. Week 2, we talked about 5 individuals that correspond to 5 eras of the Old Testament. Who were they? There you go. Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David. And we talked about 3 regions that are important to know. What are those 3 regions? Mesopotamia, Canaan, Egypt. Perfect. Well done. Give yourselves a hand. Good. That was not a very good hand to give yourself. When you get home, give yourself a better hand. Anyway, now we talked about when we start this study, and this is probably the last time we're going to recap this, but we talked about that one of the goals of this study is to clean up the dysfunctional closet that we all have. Right? We have any number of Old Testament stories, Old Testament stuff, Old Testament names, and we've taken all this stuff and we've just thrown it in the closet and we're like, maybe someday I'm going to deal with this. And so you read through the Bible, you read through the Old Testament, you've got stories about whales and animal sacrifices and human sacrifices and giants and swords being stabbed into people so that their fat wraps around the sword. It's in there. Frogs. Frogs everywhere. That's my favorite plague. Someone dressing up as a prostitute and seducing their father-in-law to prove a point. Like all of these stories, we throw it in the Old Testament. And as I was writing this up, I thought, if someone wanted to make a fictional God, which some people say, like, when they look at the Bible, they're like, well, it's all made up stuff. Somebody was trying to get people to believe in this fictional God. I don't think you're gonna leave all this stuff in. Like, you're gonna candy coat it. You're gonna make it look a lot better than what we read. It's really, really messy. But this is the real story of a real God who interacted with real people in real places at a real point in time. But again, it's hard to make sense of it all. It feels sort of random, so we want to give you some shelves. We want to give you some hangers, some things, some ways for you to organize your closets of the Old Testament, and the rest of Scripture is a little more organized in your mind. And one of the main tools that we're going to use, we're going to talk about it tonight, to help manufacture those shelves, manufacture those hangers, is a general law that the writers of the Bible use to make sense and to provide order for their writings. It's a concept called covenant. As much as we might think, or as much as it might appear, the biblical writers didn't just randomly scribble out some stories and some anecdotes. They organized their thoughts, they organized their writings in a systematic way in order to communicate certain truths about God, in order to communicate certain truths about reality and humanity. So what we need to do then is to understand their system and allow that system to organize our closet. So, for example, the other night I organized my bookshelves at home. Okay, that was super fun. So I organized my bookshelves at home. If you were to come over and want to find a book on my bookshelves, you're going to need to know how I organize them, right? You're going to need to know my organizational structure. There are people that organize their bookshelves according to the color of the spine. Have you seen these? Looks really pretty. I don't know how you find anything in it. I think it was pink. No, it was black. Anyway, so in order to find a book on my bookshelf, you have to know my system. In order to understand the Old Testament writers' organizational structure, you have to understand how they organize things, how they organize their thoughts. So, like I said, the concept of covenant is vital to understanding the Old Testament. Why is it so vital? Why do we say that it's so vital? If it weren't vital, why would we split our Bible in two sections, the Old Covenant and the New Covenant? And some of you are going, I looked in my table of contents. Mine says Old Testament and New Testament, right? Yes. Well, the actual word from which we get covenant is or the actual word that we get testament comes from a Greek word, diatheke. Maybe not. Which comes from a translation of a Hebrew word, which is berit, which means what? It means covenant. So originally, the original word is covenant, and then it's translated to Greek and whatever, and that's where we end up getting testament from. So the whole Bible is actually structured around the concept that we're going to talk about, this concept of covenant. Okay, I'll give you a second to write those down before I move on. Now, besides the structure, the overall structure of the Bible, we talked about 5 central figures in the Old Testament. You all named them so well because you've studied well. Each one of these figures plays a part in the theology of the Old Testament because there's a covenantal relationship with each one of them. Between each one of them and God, there is a covenantal relationship with each of those 5 figures. Okay, so we have Adam. Right? We had the agreement between him and Eve and God in the Garden of Eden. Don't eat from the tree of the Garden of Eden. If you do, you're going to get kicked out, all that thing. Noah, after the flood, what was the promise? I'm not going to do it again, right? And the whole rainbow thing. Abraham, Abraham, regarding his descendants in the land of Canaan, God said, Abraham, I want you to go. I want you to go to a land that I'm going to show you. And if you do this, if you listen to me, you'll have lots of descendants. You'll have lots of land. You'll be prosperous. You'll be blessed, so you can be a blessing to the world. Moses, with him and Israel at Mount Sinai, it's probably the most famous covenant. We're going to look at it in some greater detail in just a little bit, but we're doing the whole series on the Ten Commandments on Sunday morning. And then you've got David regarding his dynasty. That if he stays true to the covenant, there will always be a descendant of David on the throne. The Messiah is going to come from his line, and so on. So with each one of these individuals, there's a covenantal relationship with God. Now, John Levinson, who's a professor of Hebrew studies at Harvard, smart dude, he says the literary legacy of ancient Israel is incomprehensible apart from covenant theology. So to get to the literary legacy of what we're talking about, you can't understand it if you don't understand the concept of covenant. Okay? So, what is a covenant? We talk a lot about it in church. We talk about it in wedding ceremonies sometimes. We sometimes talk about it in terms of a contract. But again, what we need to do is figure out what it meant in its original context. And we need to do that before we can understand what it means for our lives. In its original context, a covenant is an agreement enacted between two parties in which one or both make promises under oath to perform or refrain from certain actions stipulated in advance. Sounds a lot like a contract, right? Two parties entering into this agreement under oath that they're going to do certain things and not do certain things. This could happen on several different levels. It could happen on an individual level. You and I could enter into an individual covenant just between the two of us. There's one in Genesis chapter 24 that's individual to individual covenant. It could be between two tribes. In Genesis chapter 26, there's an example of those. Or at the national level between my country and your country. There's one of those in Joshua chapter 9 and 10, which we'll read and go through in just a little bit. And the national level treaty, the national level covenant is the one that we're going to go into great detail because it's the one that's going to help us understand most fully this idea of covenant. But before we can do that, we need to look at the worldview of Israel from which these covenants came from. Okay? So we're going to look at a concept called fictive kinship. Fictive kinship. What the heck does that mean? We're going to get into it. All right, so this is the foundation for understanding covenant. If you don't understand this, you don't understand covenant. We talked in previous weeks, particularly in week 1, about the idea of the Beit Av and how one's standing in their tribe and their society was determined by what? Your standing in your society in the Beit Av is determined by what? A couple of things. Family, right? The lineage that you come from. What else?
What about the money?
Money, not so much money. Your gender and your birth order. What family you come from, if you're a male, no offense ladies, and if you're the oldest male. Okay, those are the things that your standing in society is determined by. Now, in that mindset and that structure, who bore the most responsibility? The patriarch bore the most responsibility, and after that, males inherited stuff, but the firstborn received a double portion. Okay, and along with that, he bore extra responsibility in the family. That's why he got a double portion. So, the story of the prodigal son. You know the story of the prodigal son? Luke chapter 15. How did the oldest son feel when the youngest son came home? He was hurt. He was more than that. What else was he? He was jealous. He was hacked off. All right, let's just say it. He was hacked off. He was frustrated because he had the most responsibility. He worked the hardest. He had his father's watchful eye on him this entire time. And now this younger brother comes home and he wasted his whole inheritance. And as a result, he threatens the well-being of this Beit Av that he is going to be the heir of. So that's why he's mad. Joshua being sold into slavery in Genesis chapter 37. Initially, what were the brothers going to do to him? They were going to kill him, right? They were going to, what did I say? Don't listen to me. Did he say to not listen to him? He's teaching the class. Joseph being sold into slavery, they were going to kill him. Reuben convinces all the others, hey, let's not do that. Let's throw him into this well, and then later I can come back out and get him. Why was that so important to him to do?
Because if he was not there, he'd get the inheritance.
Well, no, because Joseph was not the oldest. Reuben was the oldest. So he's responsible for taking care of the younger brothers. So when he goes back to the well, finds out his brother's not there, he cries out, he rips his clothes because he's like, I'm in trouble. Because it's his responsibility to take care of the younger brothers, and he hasn't done this. And then Boaz, Ruth and Boaz, in Ruth chapter 3, he says, there's a relative closer than I. When Ruth asks, hey, can you redeem me, redeem my land, whatever, he's like, well, there's an order with which we need to do this, and there's a relative that's closer than I, so let's check with him first. He's like, nah, I don't want to do this. And Boaz is like, okay, I will go ahead and do that. All right? So the idea behind all of these stories is that one's level of responsibility and their privilege with another individual is determined by blood. So the closer you're related, the greater your responsibility. Now, if there is someone who's not considered to be kin, they don't have that bloodline connection, how could they establish that? How could they establish that relationship of responsibility and privilege? Were they just out of luck? Hey man, I'm sorry, we're not related, you're out of luck. Good luck, well done. Did they have no chance whatsoever? What they would have to do instead is they would have to make them kin where there was no kin. That's fictive kinship, okay? And that's what it was established by. Fictive, or another word is fictional, okay? Fictive kinship. And what fictive kinship is, it's kinship ties where there is no blood or marriage connection. It's that connection where there is no blood or marriage connection, and both parties agree to act like family. So no matter the level, if it's an individual situation, a tribal situation, a national situation, if you needed someone to act like a family member, and you're willing to give them the privileges that come with that family standing, you'd invite them into a covenant relationship, which created this fictive kinship. Okay, so a couple modern examples that might help this make sense. Marriage and adoption. Okay, when I married Marcy, my wife, she received all of the responsibilities of being a Fitzpatrick, along with all of the privileges. And can I just say, there's a lot of those. It's probably more responsibility than privilege. But anyway, so that happened through marriage. Adoption. As you know, we've got two adoptive kids, Bantu and Nafi. We adopted them years ago. Do I have any less legal responsibility to them than I do to Colin and Hannah, my biological kids? No, it's the same. There's no bloodline, right? But we still have that legal responsibility. Side note, doesn't apply to anything. I shouldn't even talk about it. I'm squirreling right now, but I'm going for it. My father-in-law, he has about 100 acres of wooded land, and they've cleared out roads, and we go four-wheeling, and they have a camp out, and all of his kids, all of his daughters, have roads named after them. All of the grandkids have roads named after them, which is really cool. None of the sons-in-law have roads named after them. I'm not bitter. a little bitter. And then we adopted, and his answer was, I'm like, dude, why don't I get a road? And he's like, it's blood. I'm like, okay, whatever. And so then we adopted Bantu and Nafi. I'm like, there's no blood, man. They still got a road. But I still don't have any, right? So by legal agreement, two parties enter into a legal agreement by which they become family and they share all the responsibilities and all the privileges that come with being a part of that family. This is fictive kinship. This is the basis for covenant in the ancient Near East. All right, let's look at a map that we looked at last week. Do I need to leave that up for any more who are still writing? Anyone? Yes? Give you a couple seconds.
Thumbs up.
That was not a couple seconds. That was like 1 second. Come on, man.
Oh, pretty long.
Did you sit right there to make me jealous of you? Okay. All right, this map we looked at last week. And as we discussed, there are two main superpowers in the region. Who were they? Egypt and Mesopotamia. Egypt and Mesopotamia were the two big ones. Now, in addition to them, there were a number of other smaller kingdoms vying for power, vying for land, lots of land in that area. But Israel consisted of a small section of land and included other groups such as the Israelites, the Judahites, the Philistines, Phoenicians, Arameans, Ammonites, Moabites, Edomites, and others. So a bunch of different smaller nations, smaller kingdoms vying for land in this region. In this region. Now, even though Israel was small, in this map it says Canaan. It was vital. Why was it vital?
It was a land bridge.
It was the land bridge, right. It was the land bridge between the two superpowers. And so as a result, the larger nations would compete for control of this area. Now, does anyone ever play Risk? Anyone? Risk players, okay? Fantastic game, fantastic game. It's a board game of global conquest. If you don't know the game, you have nations, you go to war against other people and roll dice and you try and take over the world. Okay, that's the goal of it. Sometimes in that game, you might enter into a treaty with another player because you want to take somebody else out. So I'm like, Brandon, you and me, we need to go after Kathy. You with me? Yes. Okay, so we enter into a treaty to go after Kathy. This also happens in Survivor. Okay, if you know Survivor, they enter into, I don't think they call them treaties, alliances maybe, on Survivor to go against the other players. It's like that here, okay? Sometimes the smaller nations would unite as allies to defend themselves against one of the superpowers, or they would subjugate themselves to the superpowers to protect themselves. Also common was the larger nations inviting the smaller nations to enter into agreement. Inviting meaning forcing them to do that, okay? And so the smaller nations would enter into this alliance with the larger nations to protect their trade and travel routes and to ensure that the bigger countries to ensure an income of regular tribute that they would have to pay. The smaller nations would have to pay a regular tribute. There are two different types of agreements, okay? One is what's called a parity treaty. A parity treaty. What does parity mean? Equal, right. Equal. It's made between two equals. Parity treaty, party one, party two, they are equals. The other one is called a suzerain vassal treaty. Suzerain vassal treaty. And this is made between a greater and a lesser power. Right? Suzerain being the greater power, the vassal being the lesser power. So in a parity treaty, the responsibilities, it's essentially limited to a military alliance. There's an invader coming along, some kind of outsider, and so it's a one for all for one kind of mentality. Okay, so when I was a kid, my brother is 4 years older than I am. We lived on a street called Oakmount in South Euclid, Ohio. Lots of oak trees on the street. And one day we were outside playing around. My brother went in to have lunch or something, and we would have acorn fights, acorns. And if we wanted to be really mean, we would leave the little pointy tip on the end, and we would throw them at each other. And so they were like, all the neighborhood kids are like, Mike's by himself, let's get him. And so they went after me, and my brother came outside, and you know how brothers are. It's like, I'm allowed to beat the tar out of you, but nobody else is.
Yeah.
And so he came out, and it was like he and I, and he just, well, it was mostly him, because he was 4 years older. But he took on the invading army of the neighborhood kids, right? In the situation, in a parity treaty, the covenant partners spoke of each other as brothers. Since they are kind of this family relationship, we are equals. They would use the family language to talk about their relationship. So it's fictive kinship. We will talk about ourselves, and we will behave as though we are brothers. The suzerain vassal treaty, parties are not equal. Parties are not equal in this case. One is more powerful, and as a result, they have the right to demand submission from the weaker parties. So, they are not brothers, but what? I heard something over here. Father and son. Father and son. Or sometimes Lord and servant, okay? But father and son. The suzerain had authority over the land and the people of the weaker nation. And they usually allowed the vassal to continue to rule his own people. So the vassal would be able to continue their own traditions, have their own government and whatnot. But legally, the suzerain owned all of the vassal's land, all of the vassal's produce. So in that case, why would a vassal enter in if all of a sudden, like, all of my produce, all of my land is yours? Why would I go into this agreement? Protection. Protection. The suzerain would protect the smaller nation from opposing nations. Now, the suzerain would often initiate this by offering land to the vassal, and so the vassal would owe his territory and his throne to the suzerain. If the vassal broke the agreement, what would happen? He would lose all that, would lose that land, and in return for this agreement, the vassal would pay a tribute, an annual percentage to the suzerain. In addition, the vassal owed what to the vassal owed what to the suzerain? Tax. We talked about that, but also military assistance too. Okay? So if somebody comes up against a larger nation, they were expected to step in and help out against the invader. Now it is important to note that the vassal was expected to be loyal to just one suzerain. They can't enter into these kind of covenants with several different nations. To do so would be considered treasonous behavior, which would not go well for them. But if you're a suzerain, you can have these covenants with multiple smaller nations. It's a benefit of being powerful, right? You can enter into several of these, but if you are the vassal, you don't have that freedom. Now, the loyalty that is expected from the vassal is a Hebrew term that I know you know called chesed. I just wanted to do that. And I know you've heard this term before. Somebody have a Bible that wants to turn it to Micah chapter 6, verse 8. Some of you might have it memorized. Is it bad that the Bible study teacher didn't bring his Bible? Is that bad? Probably bad. Probably bad. Micah 6:8. Anyone want to read that? She's working on it.
I got it.
Go for it.
She has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God.
That word mercy there, also in other translations as kindness, is the word hesed. Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7 says this: The Lord passed before Moses and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in hesed, steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping hesed for thousands, steadfast love again. So you've heard this term, just different versions of it. So the word that describes the loyalty that the vassal has for the suzerain is translated a number of different ways in Scripture: love, loving kindness, mercy, faithfulness. But the best translation is covenant faithfulness. Covenant faithfulness. It's a kind of loyalty, that comes from.
Rise, plead your case before the mountains.
Oh my Lord. Oh my gosh.
It's so great. I love it so much. So can I tell you a story? This is also not on the syllabus. Pastor Dennis, his first staff gathering here we have the entire church staff, and in August of 22, he's giving his rah-rah speech, and I believe in you, and I have your back, and he's giving his rah-rah speech. Well, my text message alerts is, and I hardly ever have the volume turned on, I did this day, is Homer Simpson going, boring, boring. And so, in the middle of his rah-rah speech, Homer says he's boring. And, see, this is just a sign of God's grace. I still have a job. So this is God's hesed towards me. Anyway, this is the loyalty that's expected from the hesed. One of the most famous examples of the suzerain vassal treaty is found in Joshua chapter 9 and 10. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read it, but I will summarize it for you. There's a nation called Gibeon, the Gibeonites. They hear about how powerful Joshua is, how powerful the nation is, and so they put themselves in rags. And they come to Joshua and they ask, can we please enter into a treaty with you? They were being deceptive about it because they weren't having to dress in those rags, but they just really wanted some protection from the other nations. So Joshua, he doesn't consult the Lord, but he enters into a treaty with them. Joshua chapter 9 verse 15 says, Joshua made peace with them. He made a treaty with them to protect their lives. The leaders of the community made a solemn pledge to them. The actual verbiage is that they cut a berit, that word for covenant. Problem with this is that Gibeon had already entered into this kind of treaty with another nation. It says 5 kings within Canaan. Same kind of treaty. Was that allowed for a vassal to do? It was not allowed for a vassal to do. It was considered treasonous behavior. So the Canaanite ruler gathers all of their armies and goes to fight against Gibeon for their behavior. What should Joshua's response be? There it is. There it is. He should fulfill his covenant. Just because the vassal was treasonous, that doesn't take the responsibility off of him. The suzerain has responsibility to go ahead and fulfill his role. He's entered into that covenant, and so his role is to protect Gibeon, his vassal. And so he fights on behalf of his adopted child, if you will, and it goes on to say that the Lord fights for him. So this kind of treaty, not unique to Israel. All the other different peoples, Hittites, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Canaan, we see examples of this kind of treaty in all of those people groups. Now, when we enter into a treaty, there is a ratification of the covenant. So if you and I were going to enter into some form of agreement, let's say you wanted to sell me your house, we would agree on a price, we would agree on a time frame, we would agree on all of those things. How would we ratify that agreement? How would we make it official? We would draw up a contract. In the old days, we'd shake hands. If we really were serious about it, we'd spit in our hands first. That means we're really serious. These agreements, they also needed some form of ratification, some way of communicating that we agree to it and the seriousness of it. Any idea what form this might have taken in the Old Testament?
You take your shoe off and give it to him?
Not exactly. It was a good try, though. Fantastic try. What else? A little more serious. I heard blood, yes. Blood.
Sacrifice.
Sacrifice, right? Sacrifices. The term is cut a berit. Okay, cut a berit. There we go.
Well, at least it didn't say boring.
Boring. Yes. So the sacrifice actually performed two functions. The sacrifice performed two functions. One, it communicated the consequences of breaking the covenant, which we'll get to in just a minute, and it was a celebratory meal afterwards. Okay? Who doesn't like a good steak? All right, an example of the consequences. This is a treaty between Assyria and Arpad in the 8th century BC. This says, this head, meaning the head of the animal that was sacrificed, is not the head of a spring lamb. It is the head of Mata'alu, which is one of the people who is entering into this agreement. It is the head of his sons, his magnates, and the people of his land. If Mata'alu should sin against this treaty, so may, just as the head of the spring lamb is cut off and its knuckle placed in its mouth, the head of Mata'alu be cut off and his sons and magnates be thrown into something. His shoulder is not the shoulder of a spring lamb, it is the shoulder of Mata'alu, etc. Okay? So they did this sacrifice, and it was a way of saying, let's do this. So they would take an animal. What? So they would, what? So they would take an animal, and they would, they would destroy the animal, and they would spread it out on the ground. I did it, sorry. And so, if you and I were entering into an agreement, I'm a suzerain, you're a vassal, please stand up. Okay? You now have to walk between this animal, and as you do, when you walk between it, it's as if you were saying, may what happened to these animals happen to me if I fail to keep my oath. That is in Jeremiah chapter 34. Good job. Have a seat. All right. Well done. All right. That's the seriousness of it. The weaker nation, the vassal nation, has to walk between this, saying, if I break this, this is how serious I take it, and may what happened to this animal happen to me. Now, in Genesis chapter 15, sorry, I get distracted. It had giblets. Anyway, in Genesis chapter, y'all are going awe over a stuffed animal. Anyway, Genesis chapter 15, we see Abram entering into such a covenant with Yahweh. Yahweh has told Abram that he's going to make him into a great nation. He's going to give him lots of descendants. He's going to make him a blessing so that he can bless the world. Abram naturally starts to question this, so Yahweh says to him, bring me a 3-year-old female calf, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a dove, and a young pigeon. They're going to eat well. And he took all these animals, split them in half, and laid the halves facing each other, but he didn't split the birds. And so how good is our God? How merciful is our God? He recognized the doubt and the fear in Abram, the vassal in this case. So as a suzerain, he begins to initiate this treaty, a covenant with him. But it gets better. Because then Abram falls into a deep sleep. And in that moment, we see all the necessary elements of a covenant. The partners are present, the animals have been sacrificed, laid out on the ground, and the words of the covenant have been recited. That day the Lord cut a covenant, or cut a berit, with Abram. But here we see a twist. Who doesn't love a plot twist? Usual Suspects, Memento, movies that have a great plot twist are awesome. There's a great plot twist here. And at this point, Abram, who is what? The vassal, he should walk between the pieces of the animal, right? He's the weaker nation. To communicate, may I be like this animal if I break this covenant? But that's not what happens. Instead, here's what happens. After the sun had set, and darkness had deepened, a smoking vessel with a fiery flame passed between the split open animals. So if Abram's now walking between the pieces of the animal, there's only one other party in the covenant. Who's walking between them?
God.
God is. Yahweh is. God was saying, I will not break this covenant. I will hold true to it no matter what. Did God hold true? Did God hold true? It's an easy answer. Yes, he did. Did Abram and his descendants? No. So whose flesh was torn like the animals?
Abraham and his descendants.
Jesus. Jesus. The representative, the embodiment of God in the flesh. His flesh was torn, as was the animals, as the suzerain, as a stronger party to appease the stipulations within the treaty. And so right here in the opening pages of the Bible, we already see the foundations of the gospel being played out in front of our eyes. And it's communicated using the international politics of the time, with Yahweh being the suzerain there to provide and protect through Hesed, and Israel has become his vassal. Let me pause there, because I don't know about you, but I think that's so good. That is so good and so brilliant and so good of God to do that. And I love it when I dig into it and I see stuff like that, like I've been a Christian for a long time, 40 some odd years. And I still get my mind blown by stuff like this. So, anyway. Let's move on. Let's look at the form of the berit. Has anyone ever used LegalZoom.com? Anyone ever used that? I'm the only one. Okay. It's an online source for creating legal documents. If you don't want to get a lawyer, can't afford a lawyer, you need to do some form of legal documents. A convenient way to do it. What's nice is that there's standard forms for everything. So you don't have to what if I missed something? Then I'm, going to be screwed. So they've got everything covered. The berit had a form as well. Not just in the biblical covenants, but in the ancient Near East as well. And so we're going to go through the standard progression, the standard form of it, and then we'll see how it plays out in our Bible. First, you have the preamble. The preamble, when I think of the preamble, I think of this. The volume's not working. My volume control's all the way back there. Anyway, you may remember, what's it called? Schoolhouse Rock. We the people. Okay, I don't sing. All right. The preamble, it lists the name and the title or titles of the initiator of the covenant. Whoever is initiating the covenant, it lists their title. Second is the historical prologue. It gives the rationale for why the vassal should go into this treaty, should go into this covenant with the suzerain. Okay. When we see covenants of the Assyrians, we don't see this part in there because they were just brutal. They would just say, do it or we will wipe you out. So they just skipped over this part. But other ancient Near East nations would use the historical prologue. Next are the stipulations. These are the Stipulations that the suzerain laid out of military and financial assistance with an expectation of complete loyalty, and that would come with certain blessings and curses, and the curses usually took some form of I will turn my military against the vassal. The king, the vassal king, would be stripped of his throne. He'd be stripped of his land. Maybe they would get wiped out altogether. Then there are witnesses. The witnesses were the deities of the two parties who entered into the covenant. And they would be invoked to ensure that the parties were loyal to the agreement. So these are the two deities of the two nations entering into covenant. Next is a deposit. This is a written record of the covenant that was sent home with each partner, and it was expected to be put in the temples of the deities that were sworn by in the covenant. So they would take it back, put it in the temple of their deity. And then there was an expectation of a periodic reading. The vassal and their people would periodically pull it out and read it to all the people to remind them what they have agreed to, what are the expectations. Let's look at an example. Not long after Moses led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, he found himself where? Mount Sinai, thank you. Mount Sinai. At this time, Israel is not really a nation. It's a bunch of various tribes, a bunch of people who'd spent a lot of time in slavery. But not only that, they were polytheists, which means what? Multiple gods. They were not monotheistic yet. And so it made no sense for them to not worship all of the other deities. Like, why not cover your bases? Let's worship the rain god and the sun god and the whatever god and this god. Let's make sure we cover all of our bases. Don't offend any of them. So how in the world is this ragtag group of people going to come together to become a nation that's not only going to occupy Canaan, but would morph into a group of people that are going to change the world? Well, it happened by Yahweh using a structure that was familiar to them at the time, which was what? Covenant, yes. They would cut a berit with him as their suzerain. In so doing, they become a nation. They become the vassal nation. And in so doing, he can teach them about himself and his expectations. So let's look at the form again. The form of the berit at Mount Sinai. Remember the preamble says the name and the title or titles of the person initiating the covenant. And that's in Exodus chapter 20, verse 2. I am Yahweh, your God. A little presumptuous on God's part, because at this point, he really wasn't their God. They had a lot of gods, but he's the suzerain, and he can make statements like that. Historical prologue. It provides reasons for why the vassal should enter into the covenant. And in Exodus 20, verse 2, he says, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. As Christians, we often talk about the freedom we've experienced. Freedom from sin, freedom from, maybe some of you from addiction, but most of us talk about it in terms of a metaphor. Like when we talk about freedom, this is more of a metaphor. For these people, freedom was anything but a metaphor. They were slaves until Yahweh rescued them from slavery and the death that they experienced in Egypt. So this freedom that Yahweh lists here in the historical prologue is very real. The stipulations, the expectations of the vassal. Again, you must have no other gods before me. Now, a little clarity is needed here. When we talk about in today's day, when we talk about living for Jesus, we don't talk about it in terms of earning God's favor, earning God's protection. We obey God because he's already been good to us. He's already shown us those things. It's in response to God's goodness. And the same is true here. The stipulations Yahweh includes in the covenant are because he's already acted on their behalf. He's already freed them. So Sinai teaches the same things as the gospel. God's actions on our behalf precede our actions on his behalf. We obey because we were first loved. Okay? The most critical expectation that Yahweh lays out here is ongoing exclusive loyalty. And so how does the suzerain express this? He says, you must have no other what? Gods before me. And then he expounds upon it, listing all of the possible permutations. Don't make an idol for yourself, no form whatsoever. Anything in the sky above or on the earth below, the waters under the earth, you do not bow down to them or worship them, etc., etc., etc. You've read that. We've been talking about it on Sunday mornings. So what is the stipulation that he lays out? Just like in any other political treaty at that time, no other suzerains. Can't attach yourself to any other suzerain. Don't connect yourself to any other deity in this case. And upon that foundation is where we build out then the Ten Commandments that we've been talking about on Sunday morning. And then again, part of this are the blessings and curses. Those are actually detailed in Deuteronomy chapter 28. Deuteronomy is simply the second giving of the law after Moses smashed the first set of tablets. We won't read the whole chapter, but basically it says, if you keep the stipulations, you'll keep the land. If you break the stipulations, you will lose the land. Okay, that's boiled down in an overly simplistic way. Yeah.
What was that? What chapter?
That was Deuteronomy chapter 28.
Okay, thank you.
Feel a little weird stepping all over the cow guts up here. It's fine. It's fine. It's not too messy. Next are the witnesses. There's only one deity that could be invoked at this point, which is Yahweh himself, because Yahweh is one of the figures entering into this covenant. So instead, Yahweh calls upon heaven and earth as the witnesses. Basically, everything in creation is my witness that I'm entering into this covenant with you. And then there's a part about the deposit, right? A written copy of the covenant is sent home with each party to be put in the temple of their particular deity. And you might remember, especially Barbie, since we already talked about it, Moses, this is an actual photo here. Moses coming down the mountain with 2 tablets in his hand. And the popular thought is that they needed that much space to write everything on. But really, it probably didn't take up that much space. So why 2 tablets?
Copies.
2 copies.
One
One for each party, right. One for each party. And since each party was expected to put their copy in the presence of their deity, they were put in the Ark of the Covenant to rest in the Holy of Holies, the footstool of Yahweh. And we don't mess with it because we melt like this guy. I was going to put the video up there, but it's a little creepy. So if you don't know this, Raiders of the Lost Ark, rent it. Yeah. So then there is the stipulation of periodic reading. You can see this in Deuteronomy chapter 31. It says, at the end of 7 years, at the appointed time in the year of debt cancellation during the festival of booths, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the location he selects, you must read this instruction aloud in the hearing of all the people. So everybody needs to hear it and remind themselves, hey, this is what we agreed to. And then you have what's called an oath and ratification. This is basically where not just Moses, who entered into the treaty, but all of the people agree to it. This is where all the parties make their formal declaration that they will abide by the treaty. And we see this in Exodus chapter 24, where it says, he appointed certain young Israelite men to offer entirely burnt offerings and slaughter oxen as well-being sacrifices to the Lord. Moses took half the blood, put it in large bowls. The other half of the blood he threw against the altar. Then he took the covenant scroll, read it out loud for the people to hear. They responded, everything that the Lord has said we will do, and we will obey. Moses then took the blood and threw it over the people. They all agreed to it. And Moses said, this is the blood of the covenant that the Lord now makes with you on the basis of all these words. And so this group of people, once the children of Abraham, have now become the nation of Israel. They're now a vassal to the suzerain, who is who? God. Yahweh. Yeah. So, fast forward to the New Testament, and you might remember hearing some of these words that we've been talking about might ring a bell when we receive communion. As Jesus has this final meal with his closest followers, he breaks the bread, and he says, this is my body. And then he takes the wine, and he says, what? This is my blood of what? The new covenant. This is my blood of the new covenant. God is again entering into a new covenant with his people, only this time, the blood that serves as a ratification of this covenant is the blood of what? Jesus, right? And once again, a ragtag, mismatched group of individuals are transformed into God's covenant people, and God has become their suzerain and their sacrifice. So it is starting to make a little more sense. We're getting some structure now that kind of ties everything together, puts a nice little bow on it. So next week, we'll start creating a framework for the Old Testament around the concept of covenant through the stories of Abraham. Who else? Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David will start organizing our closet. Any questions? Yeah. Oh, you're going to ask a tough one. I know it. That is badly placed confidence. Go ahead.
We were talking about the Gibeonites.
Yeah.
That had treaties with several other suzerains.
Yes.
How do you pronounce that? And the question was, what was Joshua expected to do? And of course, he honored the covenant. But what about the 5 other suzerains? Were they not honoring the covenant by not attacking the Gibeonites in the first place? And could Joshua have used that same reason for not honoring that covenant because the Gibeonites had broken it? So was he still responsible for keeping it, even though they had broken it?
I think I missed the first part of the question, but he was honoring this is my interpretation, okay? He was the last one to enter into it. They had already entered into it in these other nations, so they were treasonous to them, to the other suzerains. Okay, so his responsibility is still to protect that vassal. They had entered into that after they had already entered into that covenant with those 5 kings of Canaan.
But were they not also being traitorous to Joshua, or to Joshua?
It could be seen that way. It could be seen that way. But he was still honoring it. Yeah.
Because they shouldn't have entered into more than one anyway.
Correct. Yep.
Well, you did pretty well.
Well, let me pray for you all, and then if you can, again, take the pens over there, put them in the bag, the markers in the thing, throw any spare papers away. I'll clean up the cow guts. So, God, you are good, and your hesed endures forever. Thank you that you love us the way that you do. Thank you that the stuff that we read in the Bible that doesn't make sense all the time wasn't an accident. But God, that you're working through real people in real space in real time. And it matters and it makes sense to us today. So I pray as we continue to dig in over the next several weeks, continue to turn light bulbs on for us so we can not just fill our heads with knowledge, but better understand really your love for us and our place in you. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Love you all. Have a good week.
You made it. Good job.
Yeah, I did. Question. Welcome to the lab now. He sends in my
I'm not working that, but what do you need?
like so I didn't receive one for this coming weekend. So I just feel walk out. We're out of town.
You're out of town this weekend?
Yeah, so I feel like there's a gap there on this one. I don't know yet.
But you're not on.
I wasn't on it, but I showed up before they had a place. So I feel like there's a place.
Yeah, there's a place.
Good. See you then. Oh, I've been here this week.
Yeah, I've been recording up there, so you'll be able to capture it.
We're gonna be this weekend too.
Oh, that's awesome.
How you doing, buddy?
Okay, how you doing?
Okay. Good to see you.
That'll be fun.
When I learned about them.
Oh, really?
Nice.
I think that we should have one email.